Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
A wide-ranging conversation, you might say, that went from personal to politics to business and back around again. The economy remains strong, but war makes clients nervous. The headline from Charlie Scharf. Kailey, that speaks for a lot of people in the marketplace, in a market today that is largely flattened out, simply waiting for signals from the White House, from Tehran, presumably, about what comes next with the war in Iran.
Yeah, knowing that we ended last trading week thinking that the Strait of Hormuz was open and markets celebrating that fact. Less than 24 hours later, of course, Iran redeclares the strait closed because the blockade is still in place. The blockade, of course, leading to the actual boarding of an Iranian-flagged vessel by the U.S. military. Vessels were fired on over the weekend, too, that had Indian flags. Of course, all of this beating the drum to potentially more talks between the U.S. and Iran taking place in Islamabad tomorrow, ahead of what President Trump says is a Wednesday evening Washington time deadline for this ceasefire. He told our colleague Jeff Mason that on the phone. It's a day later than most of us thought.
He's added a day again. This happened last time we had a deadline, an ultimatum like this, and in fact went so far as to tell Bloomberg's Jeff Mason, get the word out on this. We want people to know. It's not going to be tomorrow night. It's Wednesday night. J.D. Vance will presumably be in Pakistan. It is apparent that there will be an Iranian delegation there as well. Just not sure exactly who will be on the other side of the table. Yeah,
we have a lot of remaining questions, including can a deal actually be reached if they all do join together at the table? As President Trump also told Jeff, he is not intending on extending the ceasefire if a deal is not in place, knowing it was just yesterday. He renewed his threats once again to bomb Iran's critical infrastructure if no agreement is made.
We're going to get an update from Kate Sullivan, who's standing by at the White House. Want to get a quick check on Wall Street? Is that the plan here? Charlie Pellet is standing by at World Headquarters in New York with his take on the markets. Charlie, how are we doing?
Right now, little change. Been that way really for the past hour or so, Joe Mathieu. 7,100 where we stand right now on that index. The S&P down 25, drop there of 0.4%. We do have the Dow lower by 72, down 0.1%. NASDAQ Composite Index down 131 right now, drop of 0.5%. On a down day for much of the market, though, we are seeing the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares gaining now by 0.3%. The VIX right around 19 with a 10-year 4.25%. Spot gold down 0.5%, 48.06 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude, major story, major move to the upside today, 89.63 where we stand on WTI, up now by about 6.9%. And Brent, the global benchmark, 95.85 a barrel, up now by 6%. So bottom line here, this rally in oil driving stocks as a turbulent weekend in the Middle East cast doubt on prospects for peace talks between the U.S. and Iran. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. A turbulent weekend in the Middle East indeed, and we could be set for a very turbulent week as well, as we are dealing, as we've told you, with a Wednesday evening Washington time deadline for the ceasefire existing between the U.S. and Iran, at least according to President Trump, as he told our colleague Jeff Mason. He also said it's highly unlikely that he would extend that beyond its expiration if no deal is reached, which raises the stakes for the talks that we anticipate will happen in Islamabad, Pakistan tomorrow between the U.S. delegation and Iran, as we still had a question as to whether or not Iran was going to show up to those conversations. The New York Times is reporting that indeed a delegation will be headed there. But let's get the latest now as we turn to Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, who covers the White House for us and is live there from the North Lawn. Thanks, Kate, as always, for joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio. We just got another True Social post from President Trump saying the deal that we are making with Iran will be far better than the JCPOA, which of course was the 2015 nuclear agreement. And this is a lengthy post, Kate, so bear with me, goes on essentially to renew some of his criticism of the JCPOA. And he says if a deal happens under Trump, it will guarantee peace, security, and safety, not only for Israel and the Middle East, but for Europe, America, and everywhere else. The operative word, of course, here, though, Kate, is if a deal is reached. Do we have any sense as to whether either of these two sides are backing away from some of their more maximalist demands of the other at this point?
We don't have any indication that anyone is backing down here. And I think it's a really delicate moment. There's a lot of confusion about what is actually happening, the public messaging. There's a lot of contradictory statements from, the president will say something in an interview or will post something, and then the Iranians will immediately refute it. There was a big question about whether these talks were even going to take place. Even as the president and the White House were signaling and saying that they were going to take place. There was my colleague Jeff Mason had a great interview with the president this morning. We learned more about, because we're in a moment where the ceasefire is set to expire in just a couple of days, and the thinking was that it was going to expire on Tuesday. The president is now making it clear that he thinks that it expires on Wednesday evening. He told my colleague Jeff that he thinks it's highly unlikely that he will be extending the ceasefire, which is very notable, of course. And it's coming at a time where the ceasefire is already very fragile. You know, the naval blockade that the president had put in place and that was there before the ceasefire, it continued through the ceasefire. He's made it clear that U.S. naval blockade will not be lifted unless there is an actual deal that is signed. So the president told Jeff that Vance is expected to leave later today for these talks. We don't know who's going to be represented on the Iranian side. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner will also be accompanying the vice president. They've been key parts of these negotiations. The president has been sounding very optimistic for quite a while now that he thinks that a deal can be reached, and we've heard for weeks now that we're close. On Friday, he was saying we'll get a deal in a day or two, but right now, just things feel very up in the air and very uncertain, and it's unclear whether there will be a deal reached before this ceasefire is set to expire on Wednesday evening.
Really remarkable, Kate. Thank you for being here for us. It was, to your point, your conversation with the president by phone on Friday, Jeff's conversation by phone today, that gives us the real news that we've been looking for here. And J.D. Vance, the president mentioned quickly, will leave later today with that delegation, presumably to come together in Pakistan for the next round of talks. There seemed to be confusion on Sunday morning about whether J.D. Vance would even attend this session. Is he still in charge of this negotiation?
It's a great question. So I actually asked the president that when I spoke to him on the phone on Friday. I said, are these talks still going to take place? And he said they probably were. And then I said, do you want the vice president to lead these discussions? Because Vance, of course, had led the first round of negotiations in Islamabad. Those negotiations did not produce a deal. So I asked the president whether Vance would be leading them, and he said, I have not made that determination yet. He said, we'll send a team. I've not decided yet whether Vance will go. On Sunday, there was confusion. I believe he said that Vance would not be going, and then the White House said that he would be going. And so, again, I think it just speaks to the layer of sort of uncertainty and confusion here, especially as the president is getting his message out in various different ways, through conversations with reporters directly on the phone, and then, of course, through social posts and then White House messaging as well on top of that.
Kate, thank you so much. Live from the White House, Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, as we play this to the panel ahead of our conversation with Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, who's going to join us in studio in just a moment. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us. Our first chance to compare notes since the weekend. Rick is our Republican strategist, partner at Stonecourt Capital. Jeanne is our Democratic analyst and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Rick is joining us live from Casablanca, the other White House, and we appreciate that. Rick, I'm going to start with you this evening because it feels like we are ad-libbing here and the market is very desperate for a plan forward, although pretty optimistic considering the fact that we are not selling off on what appeared to be an open Strait of Hormuz on Friday. How important will it be for the president to telegraph clear directions to the American public and the marketplace in the next 24 hours?
Yeah, certainly people in Morocco are very concerned about where we go from here and not really confident as to what that path looks like. And look, I mean, to say we're even in a ceasefire is a little bit of a misnomer because we've been firing on Iranian ships. Iranian ships been firing on Americans. I mean, like all weekend, it didn't look like a truce to me. But at the end of the day, I actually think this device by President Trump may be useful. I mean, his optimism seems misplaced, seems unfounded, seems premature. But I think it's good to be optimistic, I guess. So I think as long as he continues on this track, saying he's confident he's going to get a deal and it's going to be a deal that Europe's going to love and the rest of the world will love, I guess that helps float the markets and keep people focused on a positive basis. But you certainly don't hear those same things coming from Tehran.
Well, we are hearing once again from President Trump on Truth Social, his latest post criticizing Democrats, who he says are doing everything possible to hurt the very strong position we are in with respect to Iran. But Jeanne, the mid portion of this post is what I find interesting. He says, I read the fake news saying that I am under pressure to make a deal. In all caps, this is not true. I am under no pressure whatsoever, although it will all happen relatively quickly. The president says, time is not my adversary. Time may not be his adversary, Jeanne, as of course he can't run for re-election, but is time not the adversary of the other members of his party who are going to see their name on the ballot in November? Can they really afford for this to last much longer?
No, they can't. And quite frankly, Kailey, neither can the president. And he knows that. And as usual, the president is saying out loud and trying to refute what is true. Time is on the side of Tehran. It is not on the side of Donald Trump. And, you know, I think when we think about these negotiations that may or may not happen in Islamabad in the next 24, 48 hours, I think we're going to look back at that first round of negotiations and say that the president's team missed. And I say that because that should have been a time to establish trust between the two sides that we could then build on to get to a deal. And even if they built a little trust during that first meeting, Donald Trump has done everything since to dismantle that trust. Beginning on Friday, when Tehran said, we'll open the strait to commercial shipping, and the president said, I'm going to continue the blockade. And it has been downhill from there. So the one thing that has to happen at this next meeting, if it does happen, is that they have to establish trust between these two sides. And there is very good reason for Iran not to trust the U.S. We had an agreement in 2015. The president backed out. We had a negotiation last June. He bombed them. We had a negotiation last February. He bombed them. And now we had a negotiation in Islamabad, and he wouldn't remove that blockade. So they have to work hard this time to establish trust. And I certainly think that's what we're hearing from Tehran. If we don't get that trust, they simply will not go to the negotiating table in good faith.
With so many questions about timeline, Rick, the president in this very long post that he just put on Truth Social lists the durations of the First and Second World Wars, the Vietnam War, Korea, and Iraq, not Afghanistan, America's longest war. But for a purpose here, he says, they like to say, I promised 6 weeks to defeat Iran. And actually, from the military standpoint, it was far faster than that. The president had said at one point 2 to 3 days, then 4 to 6 weeks. He said that we have already won. Will he regret statements like these?
You know, I don't think he really regrets them, because at the time, I'm sure they served a useful purpose in his mind as to trying to influence what was happening in Iran. I would say I don't disagree at all with Jeanne, but I would say probably the most disingenuous and non-trustworthy group of people who have ever negotiated a settlement to anything are the Iranians. So maybe it's just like they're all in the same hot water. But I do think that the president's tactic, is to basically increase pressure, make outlandish statements, claim that, he's going to unleash death and destruction, and then sort of back off of them. Seems to be mellowing out a little bit, and to the point where mostly what he's letting them do is the military take action and talk about how optimistic he is to get a settlement. At some point, you got to talk about Iran. They are vastly divided. They sent 80 people to the last negotiation, which tells you one thing, and the most important thing: they don't trust each other. And so if you have a counterparty who's looking over their shoulder as to who's going to survive to the next negotiating strategy, I think it's incredibly hard to think you're going to make fast progress.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so clearly we're dealing with some trust issues on all sides, even perhaps inter-side trust issues. And there are some conflicting narratives emerging. Jeanne, on the subject of conflicting narratives, just quickly, we heard from the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, on a Sunday morning interview yesterday that it's possible that gas won't be with a three-handle $3 gasoline once again until next year, as in beyond the midterms. President Trump told The Hill today that he thinks the Energy Secretary is wrong about that. And I wonder what you make of that insistence from the president when a man who used to be an energy executive, mind you, before the administration, is saying that's what he sees.
Yeah, and it was interesting because just last week, Donald Trump told Maria Bartiromo on Fox Business that it could be until November. I have some empathy for Chris Wright. He is probably correct when he says it's going to be slow coming down once this thing is over. But of course, that's not something the president or Republicans writ large want to hear. They need this to come down. They need it to come down quickly and certainly before the midterm. So the president is sort of on both sides of this. And I think Chris Wright is right, Kailey. I'll end it like that.
All right, Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors, the both of them, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm pleased to say joining us next, right here in our Washington, D.C. studio, is Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York, who is back with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congresswoman, great to see you in person. Thanks, as always, for joining us. I would love to get your reaction, and I understand if you haven't read this whole thing, as it's lengthy and it just dropped from President Trump. But he says, in regard to making a deal with Iran, he is under no pressure whatsoever to make a deal, and that time is not his adversary. And I wonder if you also believe that there should be no time limit on how long this takes, given the especially economic ramifications we're seeing here at home.
Well, I think in terms of the negotiation, the United States does have the upper hand here. He does have the leverage. But yeah, there's the political pressure. I mean, I think that's two different things here. I think in terms of making a deal, when they go in there tomorrow, hopefully this meeting will happen. I think it is very high stakes. I think that there is a lot at stake for the global economy. You're seeing the numbers today that have come out. I mean, it's very volatile right now. And I think that the sooner we can get a deal and reopen the strait and allow for oil to be flowing, it's going to be, I think, very critical, and it'll really dictate where gas prices are going to be going. But the political reality at home, I think, is a different story, right? I think a lot of people, look, we all understand why he's doing this in terms of wanting to take a number one terrorist sponsor off the table. And I think that's critically important for the future, to make not just the Middle East, but the entire world, our military that's overseas, our embassies, here at home, making sure that we stop future terrorist attacks. And I understand that that's critically important, but I think when you look at the ground, right, like when we're here we're in the district and you see gas prices increasing, that's at the end of the day, I think, what a lot of constituents are paying attention to. How much is this costing me? And so, yes, it is an investment long term. It is important to get Iran's nuclear capability off the table. It is critically important that we help cripple them economically so they can't finance Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and these terrorist bad actors. But at the end of the day, what are constituents looking at? They're looking at gas prices, and that's what they see directly affecting them. And so, you always say, like, if you prevent a terrorist attack from happening, it didn't happen. So maybe you don't get so much credit for preventing it. It's only if it does occur, then you're to blame. And I think what the president's trying to do here is important, but we also have to be realistic about what people are feeling on the ground.
To that end, and it's good to see you, Congresswoman. We've got $4.04 a gallon for the national average. In your state of New York, it's $4.10, a little bit north of there. And of course, we're in the fives and in some cases sixes when you go out to California, states on the West Coast. Is this the cost of doing business then? The president has said he thought it would be even higher to think of going to war with Iran. But of course, you've got this kind of steady drip for people. If it's months like this, what will it mean for people in New York?
Look, I think you notice that in those blue states, the price is higher because of some of those state policies, those state taxes that are added. What I'll say is that, look, under Joe Biden, when Russia and Ukraine broke out, and we weren't even directly involved, you saw 5 months of high gas prices, and that it hit $5. And that was the national average. Right now, it's about $1 less than that. It's only been a few weeks into this. That's why I think the negotiations tomorrow are so critically important, and we'll see what happens if there could be an extension to that ceasefire, which is obviously very fragile. Then you have the parallel issue between Lebanon and Israel, which seems to also be holding for the moment. But there's a lot at play here, and I think that the bottom line here is the sooner you can get these gas prices down, the better it is. But in comparison to where we were with Joe Biden, it's still much lower and for a shorter period of time. But with that said, President Trump in his first term, as well as when he first came in here, gas prices plummeted. And we got to remember that he has the ability to lower these prices if we can resolve this conflict, because he's ramped up domestic energy production. We just broke ground on a pipeline that's going to go down from the East Coast, up the East Coast, I should say, to New York, right in Hakeem Jeffries' district in Brooklyn. Chris Wright was there breaking ground the other day. So there's a lot happening in terms of energy infrastructure, energy independence, ramping up that domestic production, and that's all good. But again, this does have an impact. We need to get it under control, and I'm very hopeful in the next 48 hours we'll get a clear understanding of where we're going.
Well, speaking of understanding where we're going, I'd also like to ask you about FISA, because you were just speaking to the notion that it's incredibly important to stop terrorist threats abroad and here at home. And the administration would argue that Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is critical in that aim. Clearly, there is some difficulty in the House around this issue, whether or not an amendment as it pertains to having warrants for this surveillance can pass. What is your expectation as to how this gets resolved, knowing the Speaker only bought himself 10 more days to figure this out?
Yeah, I mean, I've been stressing to my colleagues that this is not the area you want to mess around with. I mean, in a post 9/11 world, as a member from New York City, this is critically important. I mean, FISA has been responsible for stopping dozens of terrorist attacks and is a very critical tool. I understand some of the members that want to make sure that it's not being used inappropriately to target American citizens. There already were a number of reforms that were put in place last Congress that we addressed a lot of those changes. And that's why we got people like Jim Jordan on board and many members of the Judiciary Committee and many members of the Freedom Caucus as well. Now there's another round of reforms that the right wing want. They did add some amendments, actually. There were a lot of negotiations last week between members of the Freedom Caucus, the Speaker, and the White House, in which they added criminal penalties for the inappropriate use of FISA to spy or to leak information about American citizen. Requiring warrants are used. So if there's communication between someone, a foreign national, and out of the United States, but they're contacting, communicating with somebody in the United States that could be an American citizen, you have to go get a warrant to then conduct any type of surveillance or data collection. So those are, I think, good reforms, but I don't know what more they can give them. I mean, what more they want? And the thing is you really can't hinder this tool because it is so critical to our national security, and it makes me very concerned between FISA and the fight that we're having right now with the Democrats on funding the Department of Homeland Security. They don't want ICE funded. They don't want border protection funded. They just feel like we should have a free-for-all and allow people to come in the country not knowing who they are, where they are, or what their intentions are. I mean, who knows about the millions of people that did come in already under the Biden administration? And they had zero interaction with our law enforcement at the border. They snuck in, and they're here. What are they doing? We don't know. So FISA is just a critical tool, and we need to get this done as quickly as possible and not allow it to expire.
Making the case for FISA 702, Nicole Malliotakis. It's great to see you, and thanks for coming back on Balance of Power. Of course, the Republican Congresswoman from New York, the voice of Staten Island, with us here on the fastest show in politics. Brooklyn, too, we've got you covered, and we'll meet you back here on the late edition of Balance of Power, 5 p.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg.